The 19th century brought fundamental changes to the world and its empires. In the early century, Spain's empire was weakened by the Peninsular War, and their control over their colonies in Las Americas was threatened by a wave of libertadores who began to promote independence from Spain. Many of these revolutionaries were wealthy criollos, such as Simón Bolívar, a Venezuelan political and military leader who liberated many present-day Latin American countries, such as Venezuela, Bolivia, Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru. Bolivar was educated in Spain and France, where he was exposed to European ideas of freedom and inspired by other global revolutions from the century, such as the French and the American revolutions. Libertadores strove to make colonial subjects aware of their oppression and lack of freedom under Spanish rule. They promoted self-autonomy and a unifying identity that was separate from Spain. As Simón Bolívar stated, "We are not Europeans, we are not Indians, we are but a mixed species of Aborigines and Spaniards, Americans by birth and Europeans by law." Colonial subjects were confused about their loyalty after centuries of foreign rule, but accepted this history of racial mixing. This struggle to create an identity of their own continued even after independence. By the 1830s, most Latin American countries had gained independence thanks to the efforts of military leaders and revolutionaries such as Bolivar. However, the recently freed states in Latin America and the Caribbean were vulnerable and unsure about how to form their governments. Some parts of Latin America were closely involved in affairs with Europe and the United States, and used them as an example to form their new governments and societies. Simultaneously, U.S. policy shifted with the Monroe Doctrine in 1823, which opposed European colonialism in the Americas, and Americans became more and more interested in the territory's resources. As Spain's empire shrunk, the United States empire grew. American colonialism expanded throughout the globe in different ways from before, but always kept their material interests in mind. Towards the end of the century, the U.S. economy demanded cheap foreign labor and goods such as railroads, bananas, sugar, and cigars. U.S. intervention in Latin America became a form of economic domination in the newly formed countries, as they brought American-owned factories and plantations. The U.S. gained control over parts of Mexico in 1848, incorporating large portions of land and people, and the American government became the middleman in the movements of goods and labor. However, the effects of U.S.-owned companies and plantations had devastating effects on the population. Throughout Latin America and the Caribbean, millions of peasants were displaced from their lands and territories by American businesses. American businesses also participated in cross-border labor recruitment, which further complicated definitions of loyalty and national identity. The newly independent Latin American countries rejected Spanish control, created their own autonomous state, but became vulnerable to U.S. intervention. Latin Americans developed an independent nationality that accepted racial mixing as a part of their collective identity. However, the aftermath of independence and U.S. intervention created difficult conditions in Latin American countries and the Caribbean, which even centuries later continues to affect the population and patterns of migration.